He was the only acknowledged illegitimate son of Henry VIII, and a child who many thought might be placed in the line of succession for the English throne. But what do we really know about the life of Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset? This is History Calling, where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past, and today I give you a full biography of the other Tudor boy. Before I get to the main video today, I have an announcement, which is that I'm very excited to share with you my new website, historycallingofficial.com. This is something I've been working on for quite a while now, but with how busy I am with other things, it's taken me a little time to get it set up. This is the homepage, and if you scroll down, you'll see links to some of my past videos and my other online platforms. There's also an About section giving you some information about me, and if you sign up to my mailing list, you'll receive a free download giving you 5 quick and easy tips for spotting good versus bad history before you buy or start reading a book in detail. Signing up to the list also means you'll receive my newsletter, which I currently plan on putting out once a month, and potentially other marketing emails about history calling related ventures, and I do have some things in the works, though I'll say no more for now. If you get tired of hearing from me though, don't worry, you can unsubscribe from the list at any point using the unsubscribe button at the bottom of my communications with you. I'm not going to spend any further time on the website now, as I obviously hope you'll go and explore it yourselves, but I've left the link for it in the description box. And now, back to the life of Henry Fitzroy. In 1512, Henry VIII had been king and married to Catherine of Aragon for 3 years, though they still had no surviving children. In the spring of that year, the Queen took on a new maid of honour, aged about 12, and called Elizabeth Blount, more commonly known as Bessie Blount. Unfortunately, no good likeness survives to show us what she looked like, but she apparently possessed great beauty, and a few years later, the king, in what would become a pattern with him, made this girl, now in her mid to late teens, we aren't sure exactly when their relationship began, his mistress. In 1518, she became pregnant by him. Their child was a boy named Henry after his father, and given the surname Fitzroy, meaning son of the king. His parentage was clear, and he would be the only child born out of wedlock that the monarch ever acknowledged as his, assuming we discount the fact that Henry would later annul his first 2 marriages. His birth took place in 1519 at the Priory of St. Lawrence at Blackmore in Essex, and although we don't know the date for certain, for the event was well hushed up, we can approximate it from a few pieces of information. He was recorded as being 6 years old in June 1525. His mother evidently wasn't visibly pregnant at her last ever court appearance, which was at an event hosted by Henry's top minister, Thomas Wolsey, in early October 1518, and nor would she have been there if she'd recently given birth, especially considering the scandal of an out-of-wedlock child. The date of the 18th of June is popularly claimed because of Wolsey's travel itinerary in 1519. He arranged for Bessie's discreet lying in and was the baby's godfather, so we can assume he had to be at the Priory within a day or 2 of the child's arrival, and because little Henry's elevation to the title of Duke took place on the 18th of June 1525, leading to speculation that it was timed to coincide with his birthday. The 18th of June 1522 had also been the date of a grant of lands to his mother and stepfather, which biographer Beverly Murphy also sees as being connected to the boy's birthday. Her book was my main secondary source for this video, by the way, and is linked below for you. I can't tell you the title of it because it contains a rude word that YouTube wouldn't like me to say, but it's written out with a couple of well-placed asterisks in the description box. Speaking of Fitzroy's stepfather, his parents had not resumed their relationship after his birth, and instead Bessie was quickly married off to Gilbert Talboys, later a baron, and was pregnant again with their first child, a daughter named after her mother, who seems to have been born in 1520, based on a later account of her age. Through this marriage, Bessie's eldest child would ultimately gain 2 younger half-brothers as well, and of course he already had an older half-sister, Princess Mary, daughter of the King and Queen. We know very little about the early childhood of Lord Henry Fitzroy, as he was initially called. Based on a letter written by Margaret Bryan, who was the lady mistress for all the royal children, she seems to have cared for him as an infant too, and we know that Wolsey was involved in overseeing the boy's care and education, and sent him New Year's gifts, including a gold collar and pearl in 1525. Murphy speculates that Fitzroy may have initially stayed with his mother, stepfather and younger siblings at their home in Lincolnshire, but at some point before June 1525 he moved to Durham Place, owned by Wolsey, and may have moved around the Cardinal's other homes too if he was attached to Wolsey's household. There was some education prior to his 6th birthday, though the complaints of a later Tudor, John Palsgrave, written in 1525, indicate that it wasn't very good, for, quote, "The barbarous tongue of him that taught him his matins is and hath been a great hindrance to me." Matins are prayers, as Fitzroy would have been raised a Catholic, for the English Reformation didn't arrive until the end of his life. Palsgrave, who had previously tutored Princess Mary, also blamed the boy's mother for the fact that he hadn't been taught better, again suggesting that Fitzroy lived with Bessie for some time in order for her to have that level of input. It seems inconceivable that Wolsey, who'd been a cardinal of the Catholic Church since 1515, would have allowed the king's son to learn his prayers so badly. As Fitzroy turned 6, the king brought his son onto the national and international stage in earnest. The child was elected a Knight of the Garter on the 7th of June that year. Then, on the 18th of that month, he was brought to Bridewell, where his father began by ennobling him as the Earl of Nottingham during a grand ceremony attended by the most senior aristocrats in the land. That would have been a good enough birthday present, if that's what it was, but the day wasn't over yet, and the best was yet to come. The new Lord Nottingham left the chamber, then came back dressed in the robes of a duke, and flanked by the only 2 pre-existing dukes in the country, those of Norfolk and Suffolk. His father now gave him the unprecedented privilege of a double dukedom, creating him the Duke of Richmond and Somerset. The choice of these specific titles was significant and marked Fitzroy out even further as a member of the royal family, even if he was illegitimate. Richmond was the title which his paternal grandfather, Henry VII, had held as an earl on and off before taking the throne in 1485, while the Duke of Somerset was in turn the paternal grandfather of Henry VII, so Fitzroy's great-great-grandfather. His new rank was to be supported by a large grant of lands, largely drawn from those previously held by the little boy's great-grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, and giving him an income of over £4,800 per annum. He was also given his own coat of arms, which you can see here. A couple of things I'd like to point out in particular about this image are that Richmond had the arms of France and England, because his father was the King of England and claimed to be King of France, but also something called a sinister baston argent, which was a silver band across the image indicating his illegitimacy. He was also given the motto, "Duty binds me," which we can be sure he didn't pick out himself, but it certainly indicates what his father wanted and expected from him. Fitzroy's astounding and very public elevation that June day made the boy the senior noble in the land, and rumours began to spread that the king, whose only legitimate child remained Princess Mary and whose wife was now past childbearing age, was considering making the boy his heir. This would have been desperately unfair to Mary, of course, who still legally outranked her half-brother, by the way, but at that time England had never had a successful queen regnant, and in a deeply sexist and patriarchal society, the idea of one was anathema. See my video on Empress Matilda, who attempted to take the throne in the 12th century, to better understand why there was still such resistance to the idea in the Tudor era. Murphy also suggests that the elevation was designed to snub Queen Catherine and her nephew Charles V of Spain, because Charles had recently made peace with France instead of helping Henry to invade it. Indeed, the Venetian ambassador at the time wrote that Catherine, quote, resents the earldom and dukedom conferred on the king's natural son, and remains dissatisfied at the instigation, it is said, of 3 of her Spanish ladies, her chief counsellors, so the king has dismissed them from court. A strong measure, but the queen was obliged to submit and have patience. If Catherine thought the double dukedom was a slap in the face to her, she cannot have been any more impressed by the other honours heaped upon Richmond at the same time, which had the effect of treating him like the heir apparent. He was made, among other things, Warden General of the Marches towards Scotland on the 22nd of June, a very prominent office, and one which the king had himself held as a child. Then he was installed as a Knight of the Order of the Garter, having previously only been elected at St. George's Chapel at Windsor on the 25th of June, and made Lord Admiral of England on the 16th of July. Now, of course, Fitzroy was far too young for these posts to be anything more than sinecures, and when the grand ceremonies were over, it was back to the schoolroom. While there were political reasons to elevate Richmond to such honours in the absence of a legitimate royal brother, we shouldn't overlook the fact that Henry VIII had genuine affection for what was, at that time, his only son. The Venetian ambassador said the king loved the boy, quote, like his own soul, and Wolsey referred to the child in a letter to Henry as your entirely beloved son. We're so used to thinking of how badly Henry treated Princess Mary during her later childhood and early adulthood, and of course we know that he would later kill Anne Boleyn, the mother of his daughter Elizabeth, that it's hard to remember sometimes that when his children were being compliant and he wasn't in a wretched mood with their mothers, he could actually be a doting parent, at least by 16th century royal standards. Still, there were limits to what Henry was prepared to do, and as Murphy astutely points out, the king resisted any urge to give his son those titles which were expressly associated with legitimate royal boys. He was never made Duke of Cornwall, which is the title the heir to the throne automatically holds, not the Prince of Wales title, which has to be granted, nor was he made Duke of York, traditionally used for second sons, and the title King Henry himself had once held before the death of his brother Arthur. The monarch instead took a middle path. He elevated the boy as high as he could without impinging on the rights of any future legitimate sons. The pair stayed in touch via letter, and as Fitzroy's education continued, he was able to write himself to his father. On the 14th of January 1527, at the age of 7, he wrote this missive to the king, for instance, which says, after most humble and most lawly, this might mean lowly, but I'm not sure, request and petition had unto your grace for your daily blessing, pleaseth the same to be advertised. I have received your most honourable and goodly New Year's gift, and give unto your said grace most lawly thanks for the same, humbly beseeching your grace to accept and take this my letter penned with mine own hand for a poor token at this time. At your castle of Pontefract, the 14th of January, your humble servant, H. Richmond. When it came to learning, reading and writing were a given, of course, but from his tutor's letters to the boy's parents, we get a sense of his wider curriculum and his attitude to learning. Palsgrave told Henry VIII in July 1525 that he was glad that Henry was content to leave the Duke's education in his hands, and was determined to make the child as learned as possible. He had never met a more toward child, and told the king that, according to my saying to you in the gallery at Hampton Court, I do my uttermost best to cause him to love learning, and to be merry at it, insomuch that, without any manner, fear, or compulsion, he hath already a great furtherance in the principles grammatical both of Greek and Latin. Palsgrave was also working on correcting Richmond's earlier bad pronunciation of Latin. The Duke could now read the first eclogue, which is a short poem, of Virgil, and 2 scenes of the Adelphi very well for a 10-year-old, and his tutor expected to have his Latin pronunciation perfected within the year. He continued by relating to the king a very relatable little anecdote about the child's speech as an infant and the effect his adult teeth were having on it, by saying, "And whereas he is sometimes inclined to lisp, I trust now at the changing of his teeth to amend that default, but much might have been done thereunto at the beginning." To Lady Talboys, the former Bessie Blount that is, he wrote at around the same time that, "On my conscience, my Lord of Richmond is of as good a nature, as much inclined to all manner virtuous and honourable inclinations, as any babes living. Now is my room undoubted great about him. For the King's grace said unto me, in the presence of Master Power and Master Page, I deliver, quoth he, unto you three my worldly jewel," yet more evidence of the King's affection, "you twain to have the guiding of his body, and thou, Palsgrave, to bring him up in virtue and learning." Still, Richmond, much like his father, liked to be outdoors, and his tutor told Henry's favourite, Thomas More, that he believed some were trying to prevent the boy being learned, quote, "which were a pity, for no man, rich or poor, had ever better wit. And though every day more people call upon him to bring his mind from learning, some to hear a cry at a hare, some to kill a buck with his bow, sometime with greyhounds, and sometime with buckhounds, some to see a flight with a hawk, some to ride a horse, which yet he is not greatly cumbered with because of his youth, besides many other devices found within the house when he cannot go abroad." In fact, reading between the lines of this letter and others, it sounds like Richmond was at best a handful and at worst a brat. Palsgrave only lasted as his tutor for around half a year, and by February 1526 he had been replaced by Richard Crook. So what were the problems? We get a hint of them in Palsgrave's letter. The Duke had a little group of boys with whom he was being taught, including his maternal uncles George and Henry Blount, and they distracted him from his lessons by encouraging him to do things like go riding and hawking instead. They were also rude to the tutors sent to teach the king's son, and he followed them in their poor behaviour. On the 26th of May, 1527, Crook wrote to Wolsey describing "the frenzy of those men who every day endeavour to drive the hearts of my prince and his young classmates to a hatred equally of study and the clergy by means of some exceedingly cunning deceits." Some of the household staff were problematic too, including a gentleman usher called Sir George Cotton. Crook said that he cancelled the child's lessons and instead took the boy out to practice archery and hunting. In addition, Cotton, quote, "happily allows clowns and players to be admitted, to warble ditties fit for a brothel before the prince in his own private chamber." Another boy called Scrope was equally difficult, mocking the lessons set by Crook and insulting the tutor so that his pupils had no respect for him. Crook despaired of the effects of all this on the Duke of Richmond's character, saying, "What will he refrain from doing as an adult when, even now, he is being taught to say to me in jest, 'Teacher, if you beat me, I shall beat you'? And why should he not think that he may say these things with impunity when he hears his classmates, who are socially far inferior to him, not only slandering me behind my back, while the servants of his own private chamber laugh at me and encourage them, but also abusing me to my face?" Despite this, Richmond was evidently academically able and impressed those who met him. In 1525, William Franklin, Archdeacon of Durham, said that the boy was "a child of excellent wisdom and towardness, and, for his good and quick capacity, retentive memory, virtuous inclination to all honour, humanity, and goodness, I think hard it would be to find any creature living of twice his age able or worthy to be compared to him." Crook, too, later said, "Is it not remarkable that a boy of 8 can translate any passage of Caesar into English?" Still, he despaired of the situation he found himself in, and said Fitzroy would have progressed much further in his studies, quote, if he had not been obstructed by Cotton's treachery. In the end, the tutor left his post in October 1527. He was replaced by George Fulbury, who, for whatever reason, apparently did much better, and would stay with Richmond until 1531. As Murphy says, this may have been because things were not as bad as the previous two Tudors had made out, for other members of the household did not complain that the Duke's well-being was suffering. Thanks to his nominal role as ruler of the north on behalf of his father, Richmond had been living mostly in Yorkshire, moving around between houses like Pontefract and Sheriff Hutton, with a huge household to attend him, 245 people at Sheriff Hutton in 1525, for instance, though it was down to around 150 by the time of his death. His household was about as well managed by his council as his education seems to have been, though, and despite his massive income, it was prone to overspending and dogged by poor inventory and bookkeeping. Before he left in late 1527, Richard Crooke made accusations of fraud, theft, and cooking the books against some of the Duke's staff, but there doesn't seem to have been any serious investigation into the matter, and though some improvements were made and some servants dismissed, the household continued to be poorly run for the duration of Richmond's time there. Given his bloodline and the various honours and posts he technically held, he exchanged letters and gifts with some of the wider royal family, including his Scottish cousin James V, and by 1527 was even mooted as a potential husband for Catherine de' Medici or Infanta Maria of Portugal, though neither match ultimately came to anything, the major stumbling block being, of course, that Richmond was illegitimate. During those negotiations, though, the rumour went about that he was to be made the King of Ireland. Again, it never happened, but the fact that it does seem to have been considered indicates how much King Henry was prepared to invest in his son. Most shockingly of all, the idea of getting a papal dispensation and marrying Richmond to his own sister Mary was also floated, in an effort to combine their claims and provide the country with a de facto male heir. Thankfully, that too went nowhere. At the same time that Richmond's marriage prospects were being discussed, his father's marriage was disintegrating, as Henry sought to annul his union with Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn and hopefully sire a legitimate boy, whose birth would push Richmond down the pecking order. It is, of course, ironic, and shows the double standards that could be employed, that Henry was claiming that he couldn't be legally married to his sister-in-law at around the same time that there were thoughts of marrying his son and daughter to one another. When Fitzroy's godfather, Thomas Wolsey, was unable to secure the annulment, he fell from favour in 1529 and ultimately died in November 1530. In a further sign of where the king's interests now lay, the care of the boy was given to Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who sent his son, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, born in 1517, to be Richmond's new companion. After the summer of 1529, the Duke began to spend much more time in the south of England, at Windsor, attending Parliament for the first time that summer. He was also declared not king, but rather Lord Lieutenant of Ireland that year. Again, no one expected the 10-year-old boy to actually discharge the duties which came with the post. He had 3 subordinates for that, and later a Lord Deputy, but it showed his high rank within the English aristocracy and, unofficially, the royal family. He spent more time with his father too, and commentators noted their good relationship. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this content, please give the video a like and hit the subscribe button with the little notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also find me on Patreon, where I share bonus material, including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts, and more. This week, for instance, my upper-level patrons are getting a review of Murphy's book, and a tip about how to read it for free. I also have an Amazon storefront where I've brought together recommendations for history-themed books, movies, TV shows, and gifts. Both are linked below for you, as is my Instagram account. Thank you too to those of you who support the channel by donating using the thanks button underneath videos. Your generosity is always much appreciated. And now, back to Henry Fitzroy. In April 1530, Fitzroy's stepfather, Gilbert Talboys, died, and although his mother did remarry to Edward Fiennes de Clinton, Baron Clinton and Say, that wedding did not take place until 1532. In the meantime, there was a tantalising opportunity which Henry VIII never seems to have considered, which was that he could have pursued the annulment of his first marriage with the intention of wedding Elizabeth Blount, still only in her very early 30s, and having Richmond retroactively legitimised. It might sound crazy, but bear in mind that the king's ancestor, John of Gaunt, had had his children by his mistress, Catherine Swynford, legitimised after his much later marriage to her, an act which ultimately paved the way for the Tudors to take the throne. Clearly the king was genuinely infatuated with Anne Boleyn at this stage though, for the option was never pursued. In October 1532 came one of the biggest changes in Fitzroy's young life so far. Having accompanied Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn to France to meet the French king, Francis, it was decided that Richmond would stay on in the country at the French court. He was appointed a member of Francis's privy chamber and lodged with the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin. He stayed in the country until the late summer of 1533, living in Paris and going on progress with the court, and I think it's safe to assume he therefore spoke at least passable French. With Anne Boleyn pregnant though, the Pope refusing to recognise that the Aragon marriage was void, and the French king doing nothing to help King Henry get his way, and Francis was even destined to meet the Pope very soon, Fitzroy was abruptly called home. He arrived back just in time for the birth of his new little sister, Princess Elizabeth, and on the 26th of November, at the age of 14, the bare minimum for a boy at that time, he was married to Lady Mary Howard. His bride, who he can only have had a passing acquaintance with at best, was Anne Boleyn's first cousin, the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk and sister of Fitzroy's friend, the Earl of Surrey. The marriage took place at Hampton Court Palace and was never consummated due to the couple's youth, but Mary would always be known as the Duchess of Richmond and Somerset, and she was Henry VIII's only daughter-in-law. Murphy attributes this union to the interference of Anne Boleyn, the idea being that her stepson would be bound to her family and not available to make a grand foreign alliance and potentially challenge her own children's rights to the throne. As she also points out though, later on, when Anne failed to have her own son, this policy must have seemed like folly, for it meant that her powerful uncle Norfolk would be more invested in his daughter's position as the potential mother of Henry VIII's grandchildren than in Anne herself. Though not living with his new Duchess, Richmond must have seen her frequently enough, as she was one of Queen Anne's ladies, and he was often at court, where he outranked everyone save the King and Queen themselves, unless Princess Elizabeth was visiting. He also continued to attend Parliament and took part in ceremonies associated with his position as a Knight of the Garter. When he wasn't in London, he went to his estates at Dorset or Sheffield, even sometimes travelling with his father-in-law, who seems to have made efforts to have a good relationship with the young man who might, just might, be King Henry IX someday. Now in his mid-teens, he began to deputise for his own father more and more, entertaining Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, in 1535, and attending the execution of 3 monks that May at Tyburn, indicating his father's approval of their punishment for resisting the religious changes he was then imposing on the country. Anne still hadn't produced a boy who could decisively challenge Richmond's position as a potential heir, while Mary had been deemed illegitimate too, and Elizabeth was an infant. Their half-brother's chances of taking the throne still looked very real. It was at around this time that the only portrait of Fitzroy was painted. The inscription on it says he is 15, which dates it to between June 1534 and June 1535. It is now held by the Royal Collection Trust, and it is a miniature by Lucas Hornbout or Hornbolt, you'll see him called both, which shows the Duke in front of a vivid blue background, wearing what looks like a nightcap and shirt. To my mind, the physical resemblance between him and his father is very clear, but you can let me know what you think in the comments. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died, and Anne miscarried of the boy whose survival would surely have ensured her own. Afterwards, it soon became clear that the king was looking to exit his second marriage, and much more quickly and decisively than he had his first. This wasn't particularly good news for the now 16-year-old Richmond, for a new wife, and Anne's lady-in-waiting Jane Seymour was already the clear replacement that the king had in mind, meant a fresh chance of a baby brother. Nevertheless, despite the fact that her fall was not to his own advantage, Richmond certainly did nothing to try to prevent Anne's demise. He was present for some of its key moments, though. On the night the Queen was arrested at the start of May, her stepson was at court, and went to ask his father's blessing before retiring to bed. The king was moved to tears and told Fitzroy that he and the former Princess Mary were lucky that Anne had not been able to poison them, as he said she had wanted to do. A ludicrous accusation, by the way, with no proof. One of Richmond's own servants, William Brereton, was also caught up in the mess that was unfolding, accused of sleeping with the Queen. Again, there is no hint that Richmond tried to save him, and he was ultimately executed. When the Queen was beheaded at the Tower of London on the 19th of May, Richmond attended, with his presence again showing his father's approval of what was happening. In less than a fortnight, the Duke had a new stepmother, Queen Jane, who Henry married on the 30th of May. Princess Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, and Princess Mary was finally forced on the 22nd of June to sign a document agreeing that she too was not Henry's lawful daughter, though her father had insisted for years already that she was born out of wedlock. This left the girl's half-brother as the third person in the land after their father and the new consort. With all three of Henry's children now illegitimate, there was speculation about the Duke's place in the line of succession. On the 6th of June, for instance, the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis wrote to the Spanish king that no less a person than the Earl of Sussex stated the other day in the Privy Council in the king's presence that, considering the princess was and here he uses a word meaning illegitimate that I'm not going to say because it's a swear word, as well as the Duke of Richmond, it was advisable to prefer the male to the female for the succession to the crown. This opinion of the Earl, not having been contradicted by the king, might hereafter gain ground and have adherents. Sussex's opinion might have gained even more adherents by the passage of the 1536 Act of Succession, which allowed the king to nominate his own heirs, irrespective of their legitimacy. Although it wasn't used at this time to put anyone in line for the throne, the possibility of naming Richmond in lieu of a legitimate son was now very serious indeed, and Chapuis looked upon it as almost certain. Any such plans were soon to be dashed in the most decisive way possible, though. Richmond had just turned 17 years old. He was seen in Parliament on the 8th of June. There were plans afoot for him to start living with his wife, and all appeared to be well. It didn't stay that way. A month later, on the 8th of July, Chapuis wrote that the former Princess Mary didn't need to worry about, quote, losing her right to the throne of England, for the king's illegitimate son, I mean the Duke of Richmond, cannot, according to the prognostication of his physicians, live many months, having been pronounced to be in a state of rapid consumption. Consumption was 16th century speak for tuberculosis, and there was no cure. Richmond was dying, and fast. While his actual illness may not necessarily have been TB, it's not like we can check after all, it was terminal, and he expired on the 23rd of July at St. James's Palace. We don't know how Henry took the news, but he received it at Sittingbourne, according to the later report of the Duke of Norfolk. The king opted to have a very quiet funeral for his only son, and the Duke of Richmond was encased in lead and taken into Norfolk to be buried amongst his wife's family. There were only 2 servants, his wife, and some of his in-laws accompanying the body to its grave. He was initially interred in Thetford Priory, but when his father was having that priory dissolved just 3 years later, the Duke of Norfolk, not the king, had the body moved to the Church of St. Michael the Archangel in Framlingham. The incomplete tomb over him and his wife, who was buried there much later, was constructed at the expense of the Howard family, and doesn't even have effigies of the Duke and Duchess atop it. So much for Henry's paternal love for his worldly jewel. Of course, the following year, Henry VIII would get what he'd always dreamed of, a new worldly jewel in the shape of a legitimate son who survived infancy, the future Edward VI. That boy died as a teenager though, just like the older brother he never knew, and first Mary, then Elizabeth took the throne, having been restored to the succession by their father in the 1540s, without ever being re-legitimised. Had Henry Fitzroy lived, perhaps he would have been placed in line as well, but we'll never know. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the life of Henry VIII's least famous child, who, despite being rather forgotten about by history, was an important figure during his own lifetime. Let me know below if you see a family resemblance between him and his father, and remember to check out my new website, historycallingofficial.com. If you'd like to hear about another of Henry VIII's sons, try this video on he and Catherine of Aragon's short-lived boy born in 1511. Alternatively, you might prefer this video or this playlist on the Tudor monarchs. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.